and welcome to this episode of Lockdown LitFest. We're very fortunate to have with us today two people who've had extraordinary careers in journalism. Peter Snow was I Ching's diplomatic and defence correspondent and presented the BBC's flagship news analysis programme Newsnight, and UK audiences will remember him as a dynamic interpreter of election night stats as they came in. Anne MacMillan was the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's London correspondent for over 40 years, and she still hasn't lost her Canadian accent. A very warm welcome to you both, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Hi, David.
Hi, David.
Hi, nice to meet you. Now, we're here to talk about Treasures of World History, which is the story of civilization through 50 most important documents, as shown here, published by independent publisher Welbeck. And if I can start with you, you said in an earlier piece that writing war stories, your first collaboration together, was helped by getting away at your local coffee shops. Now, did you manage to finish this before lockdown, or did you have to do without?
Well, thank goodness this book was well finished before the lockdown. As you held it up, and it's quite a big book, and it's full of the most beautiful pictures. And so it took quite a long time to produce. So luckily, we were not in lockdown when we wrote this book. If we were, David, we might not still be sitting here smiling.
It has been a challenge. I mean, as I was saying to Palash before setup, I've actually put a shirt with a collar on for the first time in 4 months today. It's the small things like that have made it very difficult. War stories, I enjoyed very much. I bought a copy to have a look at it. And could you tell us a bit about how that book came together and how the experience of selecting some very excellent and not at all well-known stories helped you to choose the documents for Treasures of World History? Peter, perhaps.
Well, I think War Stories was a sort of natural follow-on from books that I've written in the past and stories that Anne and I both covered. Dreadful stories about war and people who get involved in war. And so we decided we'd write together a book about the kind of people that we've met in the 20th and 21st centuries. But more importantly than that, in many ways, some of the people in the past who've had dreadful experiences in war and who've been under various headings like compassion, courage, and cunning, and spying, and so on. So we put all that together, and we got a wonderful book out of it. It was
well, you say dreadful, but actually the stories are quite uplifting, aren't they?
Yes, I suppose they are. Some of them are very uplifting. The people themselves show enormous courage sometimes. It's absolutely right.
And how do you think that informed our? How do you think that informed our choice of these documents?
Yes, well, quite strongly. I mean, clearly, a lot of these. I mean, for example, one person, Anne Frank, who was tragically caught up in the war, in the Holocaust, and she was hiding away in a cupboard and writing a wonderful diary. And it just occurred to us that we could choose 50 documents out of those people's experience, and also just documents like Magna Carta, which aren't in a sense a war story, and try and show people how these documents have been a huge monument to human endeavor and enterprise and experience over the centuries, all over the world. And so it sort of followed on naturally from war stories.
One of the things I enjoyed very much about war stories was that you always had a little bit about what happened next. It's not just the story, and it's the actual outcome, how those people, those heroic people doing amazing things, live their lives or have their lives tragically cut short. And I noticed you brought some of that into the Treasures title as well, particularly your piece on Gallipoli, which I also visited and was very affected by.
Yes, the Gallipoli one, you specialized in that one, didn't you?
Yes, I mean the story about Lieutenant Tubb and his extraordinary battle at Lone Pine is just so devastatingly frightening and dreadful. And he somehow managed, while he was in this trench almost, to write his diary the following day. He was in and out of this trench getting some food and also sheltering from the bombs that were going on the day after he had this appalling battle at Lone Pine in Gallipoli. And his diary is really incredibly evocative. And it just tells us how dreadful it is to be caught in the major major melee that takes place sometimes in these battles, and it was beautifully done. We thought we'd choose him as an example, rather like, and Frank tells a story about someone who's having to shelter from the Nazis. Here's this guy openly fighting against the Turks in Gallipoli and telling us his story in the most wonderfully clear and honest way.
And modest.
Absolutely modest. Yes, totally modest.
He won a Victoria Cross for his action.
He did indeed.
Yeah, I saw he was tragically shot in 1917, so he didn't live for much longer afterwards. One of the things that affected me most about Gallipoli was how many Turks were there going to visit their monuments, because of course for them it was a great victory. And I'm talking to several Anzacs who were there at the time. It was quite close to Anzac Day a few years ago, and they were puzzled by the presence of all these Turks, thinking, why are they here? But that's kind of an aside. That was just something that struck me. I don't know if you felt the same way.
Well, certainly when you see that enormous column with Ataturk's words about these are all children of God. I can't quite remember the exact words, but he was so inclusive, bringing in all the.
There are some now, it finishes, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. That was very moving.
Gallipoli was an extraordinary event in history. In 1915, to have been involved in that. Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, David. Sorry, David, you were saying something.
I just moving on, and just going to ask you where the whole idea for the Treasures book came from originally.
Well, I can answer that quickly, and then Peter can elaborate. Dan, our son, Dan Snow, and Peter wrote a couple of books in the same format, so coffee table books, one about the Battle of Waterloo and one about treasures of British history. And they asked Dan and Peter if they'd be able to write one about world history, because the 50 Treasures of British History sold very well. And Dan was too busy. So I put up my hand and said, well, how about me? And luckily for me, they said yes.
Thank goodness. She's a marvelous co-author. We had such fun together doing it. But no, it did come out of the first book about world history, about British history. And it just seemed to us to be crazy not to be including America and France and Germany and Italy and indeed New Zealand and Australia,
China,
all the other countries around the world. Yeah, exactly.
India,
China, where huge events have occurred, and documents have been absolutely at the centre of those great events.
Peter, you were telling us about where you had the idea for Treasures. I think you said it came out of the book you've written with your son Dan.
Yes, well, I mean, we wrote this book together. Dan and I wrote this book about British history, documents that tell the story of British history, going right back to, for example, Vindolanda, that wonderful Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall, where they discovered this amazing earthen tablet, which was a description of an invitation to a birthday party. It was wonderful human stuff, and it just took us right back to the Roman times in Britain. We wrote that book together, and it occurred to us, me and Dan, and indeed Anne as well, that it's crazy to write a book about British history and not include, in many ways, more exciting overseas European, American, South American, Australian, and New Zealand history. And to write a book about world history and documents that have illustrated that would be very exciting, dramatic, and useful for people. So we got on with that, and Dan and I started talking about it, and then it became quite impossible for Dan, who's incredibly busy with his History Hit program, to do it. So Anne just stuck her hand up and said, come on, I'll do it. She's a journalist. She's a far better journalist than I am. And so Anne said, right, come on, I'll do it. And so we did it together.
That's terrific. That's absolutely terrific. So I see from the press release you started off with 200 documents. I don't know how you got to those 200 and how you got from those 200 down to 50.
Well, we are blessed in this family to be surrounded by real historians. Our son Dan studied history at Oxford and has gone on to do endless history programs for BBC and various other outlets, and has his own television online thing called History Hit, which is full of history documentaries, and a podcast, of course, which is popular. But my sister, Margaret MacMillan, is also a fantastically good historian. She did the Reef Lectures a couple of years ago. She wrote a book called Peacemakers about the Treaty of Versailles, and another one about the origins of the First World War. And in fact, her book about based on the brief lectures is going to be published in September. It's called The Sign of Cain. So we sat down with them, I have to admit, and we also talked together a lot because we, as journalists, we come across an awful lot of documents.
Yes.
And we both love history. So we had a long chat with both of them. We came up with this huge list. And then what did we do? You take it from there.
Well, we argued. There was some perfectly obvious. I mean, you can't not have Magna Carta. You can't not have the Declaration of Independence of America. But we argued about some. I thought some were pretty sort of trivial and unimportant. And so did Anne think some of my ideas were pretty unimportant. And we had one thing we had a bit of a row about was good old Einstein. I mean, Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, David, I'm sure you know it backwards. I find it almost impossible to understand. And it did understand.
You asked David whether the coffee shop trick worked. It wouldn't. I think even that going to a coffee shop would not have saved this argument. I decided to take on Einstein's theory of relativity, which was very brave because I have no scientific background. My dad was a doctor, so I sort of have vague recollections of medical talk. But I studied English at universities. But I thought, I'm very curious and I love research, so I'll really do this. I spent ages researching Einstein, and I finally think I got my head around it. And I spent ages writing it, much longer than any other document in this book. And I finally finished it. And with a flourish, I thrust it at Peter because we look at each other's work and make suggestions, obviously.
Yes.
And there was a long silence for about 2 hours. And then he came back and said, I don't understand a single word. And I could not believe it. So I just literally threw all my research at him and said, well, you do a better job. So he couldn't. So we sent it to an acquaintance who got a first in physics from Oxford. And he read it, and we both sat waiting, Peter hoping that he was going to say this is absolute rubbish, and me sort of hoping that maybe he'd say that I had one or two thoughts right. And he came back saying, for someone thinking it was Peter who had written it, because Peter sent him the document, for someone who hasn't a scientific background, this is admirable. He did make one or two very, very good suggestions. Very nice man. And I incorporated them into my piece, but I am rather proud of that particular thing.
But I'm sorry, David, the key point is you can't not have Einstein's general theory of relativity without, you can't have a book like this without including that extraordinary document. And so it went on, and we had document after document.
And we wanted to go around the world, as you said.
Exactly. I mean, but Anne had I think Anne had some of the best ideas for documents we should use, didn't you? I mean, come on, one or two of your ideas.
Well, the BNA Act, the British North America Act, I'm Canadian, as you might be able to tell, which set up the wonderful country of Canada
in self-interest.
1867. So there were a few. And I thought we also should, certainly in the 20th century, look at modern culture. So we have sketches of Coco Chanel's dresses and a description of her and how she became such a fashion icon. And then also we mentioned Woodstock and we mentioned the Beatles. So there's a bit of sort of modern documents.
You may ask, David, I'm trying to probably pretty much going to ask, but you may ask what the Beatles got to do with documents. And the answer is it's a fascinating story.
Yes, in our book we've got an envelope, a used envelope, and on both sides of it are names of cities scrawled obviously very quickly. And they were scrawled by Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, in 1964, just after the Beatles had made a huge American hit on the Ed Sullivan Show. And this was their plan. Peter has
David, let me just show you
the envelope.
The envelope. There it is.
You can see his writing.
You can see the brown one on the right-hand side.
Yeah, you can see his writing with all these city names. And sure enough, the Beatles went to North America in 1964 to the Ed Sullivan Show, became huge hits. Then went back in August, and they toured 32 cities, and they played 33 concerts in less than a month. And they went right across from Montreal to San Francisco and all sorts of cities in between. And they hadn't really been a huge hit in the States. They were the way they were in England when they first started releasing their records. And the Americans were a bit sniffy about them. They called them a sort of novelty act, and they joked about their hair and their boots and their matching little suits. And One really nasty journalist said that Britain was suffering from an infestation, a beetle infestation, and so the American record company didn't think that their music would sell well in the States, but it did once they went on the Ed Sullivan Show, and this tour really established them as the band of the century, and. Great stories. I mean, they went to San Francisco was their first set of concerts, and the police had put up barriers, as they would for somebody like Judy Garland or Frank Sinatra. But the fans just literally stormed over them, and something like 100 fans almost got onto the stage, and 100 more were injured in the crush. And the Beatles had to be taken back to their hotel in an ambulance to disguise them so that the fans wouldn't run after them. And there were riots in New York, and in Salt Lake City, they had to jump into a passing seafood truck to avoid their fans. And it was total chaos, but they were just such a hit.
But the point is, David, this document, these names scrawled on the back of an envelope, are in a sense an absolutely central part of history. I mean, they are what got the Beatles, what got pop music into one of its greatest possible moments in history.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, for the 1960s, the Beatles, the whole 60s ethos really was almost built around the Beatles, the Stones, and indeed Woodstock, which you also mentioned. There's a song with the famous line, "I'm going down to Yazka's farm, going to join a rock and roll band."
Well, that Woodstock is a great story too. This is what I think Peter and I loved about this, and being journalists and loving history, it was sort of perfect combination, because the stories behind these documents are absolutely riveting. And in Woodstock, I'm sorry to go on about sort of 20th century pop, but Woodstock was almost a disaster because the organizers decided to make it. You have to pay to go there, and what we have as our documents are tickets for the 3 days of the weekend, and they hadn't realized how many people were going to show up, so they hadn't got enough fencing around the place, and so eventually they just gave up and said, "Okay, free, everybody just come." All the roads were completely blocked in the whole area in upstate New York on this farm, and people left their cars on the roads and walked miles to get into Woodstock. And the list of performers is just extraordinary, ending with that amazing Jimi Hendrix. Oh, say can you see? I mean, unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, that brings us very neatly, in fact, to one of the other documents you selected, which is the Star-Spangled Banner. And there's a very good story and a beautiful picture. Again, Peter, if you'd be kind enough to hold that up for everyone.
Yes, I can show you that picture, I think, if I go to the...
But this one is very close to Peter's heart because he found out about this in a book he wrote called The Burning of the White House. And he discovered this story.
Here we are, there's a picture. Now, this is a picture of Francis Scott Key, a young American lawyer and poet, who stood on this ship watching the most dreadful moment in American history when the British were attacking Baltimore. And they were trying to shell the Fort McHenry at the entrance to Baltimore Harbor. If that fort had fallen, Baltimore would have been British and America might indeed have fallen. And the War of 1812, which this was, would have been won by the Brits. But he looked through the dawn and he saw the American flag, the Stars and Stripes, was still flying over the, it's over here.
That is the actual flag, isn't it?
That's the actual flag.
It's now in the
That is the actual flag there, which of course is in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. And as he looked through the dawn's early light, as he described it, he saw this flag still flying, and he thought the fort has survived, Baltimore will survive the Brits. And he wrote a poem, "O Say Can You See by the Dawn's Early Light," which of course became later on the American national anthem. So it's really that document, that a poem scrawled on a piece of paper by this young lawyer looking from the ship at the flag. It was a great moment in history, and that document, that poem, describes it very, very evocatively and brilliantly.
But tell the story about how the poem went on to become the national anthem.
Well, I mean, he just shoved it in his pocket after he'd seen the flag going up. He went over to the pub in Baltimore the next day. The Brits pulled out. It was the end of the War of 1812 for the Brits, for America. But they just said, we can't possibly win this war. The Americans succeeded in holding on to Baltimore. We'll go home. And he went over to the pub and he read it to a friend. He said, "I just wrote this poem." The friend said, "That was pretty good. I mean, that's a nice one." And a few of our other friends came and said, "That's a great, you must write a song to this." And so they wrote a song to it. And it turned out that the song was, "Oh, say, can you see?" And they thought, this is brilliant. And
Wasn't it a British drinking song?
it was a British drinking song. They said, "That's
Oh,
right."
really? I didn't know that.
That's right. It's only 30, 40 years or so since the place had been British. So the British drinking song was all part of the fun. And it was set to a British drinking song. And then you won't believe this, but for 120 years, it just sat there being sung in a pub by a few chaps in Baltimore. And then suddenly it got more and more popular. And so it became the American national anthem. What I think is so lovely about it is that we Brits inspired the American national anthem by attacking Baltimore. Not many people know that, I think.
No, that's you could almost say that the defense of Baltimore actually preserved the whole United States as
Yes.
Otherwise,
it did. I mean, it's probably a slight mistake to think that the War of 1812 was an attempt by Britain to recover America. It wasn't. It was just an attempt to bash them up for having interfered in the Napoleonic Wars on behalf of Napoleon and to grab a few opportunities from poor old Britain at that time. Yes, I mean, it was a terrible moment for the Americans. And they saved themselves by fighting brilliantly at Baltimore.
Absolutely. Well, there are obviously a good many other documents which are chosen, which do cover global history, from the stele of Hammurabi with his code of laws, right the way up to Tim Berners-Lee and his invention of the World Wide Web. And in between, you cover China, you cover India, you cover religion, you cover military history, you cover all sorts of things. Are there any particular documents you really regret having missed out?
What ones do you regret having missed out?
Well, I mean, yes, all sorts of things like maps with amazing names on. I mean, incredible things like Ptolemy's geographers, map of geographers, Ptolemy, the amazing geographer's map of the world, which is a wonderful document. All sorts of documents we have to leave out, and we were rather sad to do that. I quite like to use the Irish national anthem. Sounds boring, Dublin, damn it. That would have been a wonderful document too. The first Irish national anthem. Soldier boys are we.
Well, also as a Canadian, the poem "In Flanders Field" was written by a Canadian.
Exactly.
And also, I mean, we have one literary person, Shakespeare, of course. We look at his first folio, but we thought of so many. I mean, so many British writers, Jane Austen and
Yes.
George Eliot, and Chaucer, and then you look abroad and look at Goethe, and you look at Balzac, and American writers, but we had to decide on one. So we chose Shakespeare because he's international. And we did the same with music. We thought of all sorts of different composers we could have chosen. And guess who we chose? Beethoven. His fifth, da 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 da, because it's the most well-known bar of music in history.
Yeah. You did also choose Homer's Odyssey, which interested me particularly because I read Greek at university quite a long time ago.
The Odyssey?
That rather than the Iliad?
Yes, indeed.
Why instead of the Iliad?
Why is that? Well, it just happened. We found this. We found a picture of it, and then pursued it, and we found that there's a little bit of parchment, tiny bit of document which was found in Egypt, which was way back in the 3rd century, a little piece of the Odyssey in which poor old Odysseus, who's got home to Ithaca, says, "Oh dear me, what am I going to do? All these suitors are gathered around my wife," and so on. So it was all very depressing, and because he decided then to shoot them all, he did very successfully. We thought that was a wonderful little. It must have been written out by some Egyptian way 2,000 years ago by an Egyptian who was fascinated by this extraordinary story of Odysseus' travels. Why didn't we choose the Iliad? Well, I mean, we could have chosen the Iliad, except that this little bit of parchment, one of the oldest manuscripts that they've discovered of the Odyssey, it was very, very, very long time ago, not quite as long ago as Homer, who of course was about 700 BC. But it was a very old document, and we just imagined. The lovely thing about these documents, you imagine the person writing them and holding them. And here we have a document that tells this extraordinary story about Odysseus and his travels. And someone there is copying it out and reading it and enjoying it. And maybe reading it to his kids or whatever. And we just thought it was a great moment in history to write about.
It is, and it's always wonderful when you can reimagine the moment when that was happening, isn't it? Are there any other examples of that you can think of which you included in the book?
Well, the I Ching, which I thought was fascinating because, again, it was a very, very ancient, tiny little bit of this thing called the I Ching, China's great philosophical book that is meant to answer all questions of the universe.
Yeah.
And I found that the backstory of this is so interesting because they think that it started about 3,000 years ago as a verbal thing where somebody would go to a diviner, a sort of oracle, and say to them, "Can you tell me whether I should get married this year?" And he would then heat up an animal bone. They're called oracle bones. And then cracks would appear. And this fortune teller basically would look at the cracks and say, if it was a broken line, he'd say this, and if it was an unbroken line, that. And this gradually built up in China to form this fantastic thing called I Ching, which is still used today. Bob Dylan's a big fan. He says not only is it full of wonderful information, but it's beautiful poetry. But nowadays you throw coins or dice or something, and that sort of tells you what the lines, how the lines. I'm making it sound much more complicated. In fact, this is another one. No, I know this is another one. I wrote it, and Peter was not at all impressed. I had to keep rewriting it to make it more. But anyway, just let it be said that the I Ching is a fascinating book with a fascinating history, and we use a very, very old document that grave robbers actually found in a very ancient part of China, and they took it to a market, and somebody smartly spotted it in a sort of antiques market, picked it up, and it's now in the Shanghai Museum.
I Ching is clearly very important in China and all over the world too, and it's well known. But a document we couldn't possibly disagree about was one that we didn't discover because it's well known that it exists. But you have to go to the Bodleian Library in Oxford to see it. It's the Codex Mendoza. Now, the Codex Mendoza is fascinating.
I wasn't familiar with that at all.
David, sorry.
I was just saying that was fascinating. That's new to me. I wasn't aware of that at all.
Yes, well, the Codex Mendoza is, if you know anything about Mexico, it's absolutely central because what happened was that when Cortes took his boys across to Mexico in 1521, they conquered Montezuma's Aztec empire, and the trouble was that the Aztecs, who of course were absolutely obliterated in terms of power by Cortes and the Spanish who came along and made Mexico Spanish, they hadn't written down their history. So there was no history of the Aztec Empire. Like, in Rome, there was Livy and all these chaps who wrote about Roman history. There were Thucydides, the Greek history, and France and England. We've all got our histories written for us. But the Mexicans didn't have any history, the Aztecs in Mexico. And so, very cleverly, the governor of Mexico, the first Spanish governor, a chap called Antonio de Mendoza, said, "Look, I tell you what, get a lot of Aztecs before they all die off, before they forget. Get a few Aztecs who know what happened, who remember what happened. Even if nothing's written, they remember from oral tradition and so on what happened the last few hundred years have passed down to them. Get them together, the best knowledgeable ones that we can get hold of, and write down what they say, and let them also illustrate what they say with little pictures." And so you have this fascinating document, which we have a picture of it. No,
do you want that one?
We do. We have a lovely picture, darling. I think that's a very good one there. Yes. Now on the left hand, on the left hand side there, you can see lots of little people chatting away, there's a woman having a drink. In those days, what the Aztecs told the Spanish is that, well, the great thing was we have all these laws about drinking, and it's a very good thing for women to drink.
Yay.
Heaven knows why or how, but anyway, so lots of women are praised and pictured here having a good old drink. And on the other side of the page, this lovely picture here is the Aztecs' description to the Spanish of how their capital, Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, how it came to be built. And what they did was they looked for an eagle standing here. As you see the eagle in the center of the picture.
Yeah.
There's an eagle standing there. And they had to look for this eagle standing on this island, which had canals. You can see the X there forming the canals on the island. That's going to be the place where we should build the capital, said the Aztecs. Said this was told by their forefathers to the great Aztec emperor at the time, about 200 years before the Spanish turned up. And so they built their capital in Tenochtitlan. And that lovely picture shows all sorts of things you really can't really see very well. All the tributary envoys from all the parts of the Aztec Empire, bringing along lots of money and presents and things to the Aztec Emperor. And so that's a beautiful picture, and it's wonderfully illustrated by the Aztecs themselves. And as I say, it's a really important historic document. Only through that Codex Mendoza do we know the real history of the Aztec Empire before anybody ever turned up.
No, it's fascinating, isn't it? How these things just happen completely by chance, pretty much. And the other thing that survived, as indeed many of the documents in the book did, entirely by chance, was the Code of Laws of Hammurabi, which is what sets the whole book off. For those who don't know, this is a stele discovered in Mesopotamia, which is the earliest written code of laws anywhere. And obviously, it's important. But what brought it to your attention particularly?
Yes, the greatest living expert sitting beside me here.
This is one we agreed on too. Thank goodness. This is a fantastic list, as you said, of laws. 282 laws drawn up by this Babylonian emperor Hammurabi in 1750 BC. That's nearly 4,000 years ago. And another great thing about these documents is some of them were just found so randomly. This was found by a group of French archaeologists digging in Iraq in the beginning of the 20th century, in the early 1900s. And they came across two pieces of sort of black rock, and they saw these inscriptions on it, and they realized that this was terribly important. They took it back to the Louvre, where it still exists and can be seen today. And these laws are the first complete list of laws of civilization. And they include all sorts of things. A lot of them are about family, about business. They have, they have the first example of innocent until proved guilty. There's also an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Some of the family ones are fascinating. For example, if a woman commits incest with her son, both are burned. But if a man commits incest with his daughter, he is only, he's ostracized, he's sent away, he's exiled. So they had a bit of discrimination against women even in those days.
It's great.
But no, it's absolutely fascinating. And Hammurabi's picture, I mean, they don't know what he looked like, but there is a picture of him on the stele. It is now, you see it in all sort of major law courts around the world. The U.S., it's in the U.S. Congress. It's in Commonwealth Supreme Courts. His image is up there with all the great lawmakers of our world.
I mean, the thing about Hammurabi too is that we think of Magna Carta as being the cleverest, wonderful sort of birth of democracy of 800 years ago in this country. We think of Magna Carta as being great. But Hammurabi was banging on about what you should do to each other and treat each other properly 3,000 years before that. So this is a terribly important it is in a sense a document on a stele. It's writing on a stele. So to us, it's a document.
It is, absolutely. And you mentioned ostracism there.
I'm very fond of that.
In modern sense.
Well, I'm sure most people will know.
Ostracon was one of the documents to include. Perhaps for our audience, you could explain exactly what an ostracon is.
Yes, well, I'm sure most people know what ostracism is and means, but many people, I think, didn't know, and certainly I learned a lot about it, what ostracism actually derives its name from. Ostrakon is a little piece of pottery or some piece of cardboard or whatever you happen to pick up in the Athenian agora marketplace at the time, and on that you mark the name of the person in the Athenian aristocracy who you'd like to see chucked out of the country because he's been a pain in the neck or something you don't like about him. I mean, maybe over wealthy or saying the wrong things about the Persians or the Spartans or something. And so every year, in principle, you have an ostracism, which means all the people, because of course in Athens in those days, 500 BC, 400 BC, every single person had the vote. Correct. Every single man had the vote. No women, forget them.
And no slaves. No slaves.
No slaves. So only the men had the vote. The men and slaves, of course, didn't. And women and slaves didn't. And so the men gathered together in the agora, in the marketplace, and someone said, "Well, now what about so and so?" And we found one particular lot of pottery, little sherds of pottery, little bits of broken pottery, with the word Megacles on them. And Megacles, a poor chap, was a member of a family, a rather unfortunate family, who nobody liked very much. And so in 486 BC, somewhat after the first great Persian invasion of Marathon and the defeat of the Persians of Marathon in 490, the Athenians got together and said, "Who do you want to get rid of this year?" And this chap, poor old Megacles, he'd been thought that his family had signaled to the Persians, "Now's the time to go and attack Athens because it's rather empty. They've all gone off fighting the Spartans or something. They've all gone out of the town." And so Megacles, people remembered this. They didn't like him. And also he was very, very wealthy indeed. And people were naturally a bit jealous of the wealthy. So they thought Megacles is tough to get rid of. So they all signed up to Megacles. And the poor chap got slung out of Athens. You get slung out for 10 years and then you can come back. So ostracism, wonderful. And ostracon, the ostracon that you ostracize people with is a little piece of pottery or something else you write on, and you just chuck it in the pot, and then they count them, and they find if you've got 6,000 of them, you're in trouble.
Democracy, red in tooth and claw, pretty much. Peter, you mentioned you were born in Dublin, and one of the many splendors of the book is an illustration of the Book of Kells, which, if you can't find it, I certainly can.
I'll find it.
Which is, for anyone who's lucky enough to be in Dublin, do go to Trinity and have a look at it. It's just the most wonderful thing.
It is. I mean, the place you see it in is this fantastic library. I mean, just look at that wonderful, wonderful building. Isn't that a wonderful picture? That's the library. In there is the Book of Kells.
Well, it's not quite. Remember, we went recently, and it used to be there, but they have now moved into a special little room.
Side room of the library.
It's wonderful.
And the Book of Kells itself is a magnificently illustrated book. Here we are. There's the sort of title page with Virgin Mary. Can you see that all right?
Yes, that's perfect.
There she is. She's sitting there with Jesus on her lap. And one quite amusing thing about it, which I rather like, is I like to think of the individuals who drew this picture of Mary. If you look at Jesus, he looks like quite an old chap, an old man. And the general thought is that the monks on the island of Iona, by the way, the island of Iona is where this was put together in 1806 AD by some monks who had to escape from the Danes rather rapidly. So they ran off with the book and took it to Kells in Ireland, just west of Dublin. And it was preserved there amazingly successfully for best part of 1,200 years until today. But if you look at Jesus, it's a wonderful picture because the general thought is that one of the monks thought, how do I draw this little chap? I think what we'll do is I'll just copy old George over there. He's got a good face. And so they probably copied one of each other's faces and put it on Jesus' face, which is rather odd, but rather enchanting.
But also, you love the serpents on the.
Yeah, you will hardly see them. You need to buy the book. There is a wonderful, which we talked about in great detail in the book itself. But there's one on the back of Mary's chair. You probably can't really see it. Here we are. There we are. On the back of Mary's chair, there's some snakes. Just here, you can't really see them in this picture, but some snakes climbing up Mary's chair. And so, obviously that's not a good thing. So there's a creature eating the snakes. And that's very, very small, little tiny part of the drawing. And so the sense of humor is so fascinating. And this is 1,200 years ago, back in 800 800 years ago.
And Peter and I went to have another. We've seen them before, but we went back to have another look last year, and the color is just extraordinary. And what is it? They turn the pages only once every 6 months.
They turn the pages I think it's every 3 months or something.
Yeah.
They turn a different page up. And in fact, the page we saw wasn't that one of the Virgin Mary. And that's the picture. That's a wonderful. The quality of the photogravure, or whatever the word is, for putting these photographs in the book is absolutely spectacular. So you see very clearly.
A really well-produced book, I have to say. After 40 odd years in publishing, I know a well-produced book when I see one. And
oh, thank you. We love it, but we would, wouldn't we?
Absolutely. So we probably need to start thinking about winding up now. So if I can just ask you one final question, which is, what's your favourite?
Shall I start with the few?
Go on.
Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. I think it's got to be Shakespeare's first folio. It is the most wonderful collection of all his plays. Shakespeare died in when was it? Shakespeare died in
1620, roughly.
No, he died in 1616. And after he died, two of the members of his company realized that 18 of his plays had been published in a fairly sort of authentic way, but another 18 hadn't been. And these other 18 included plays like Macbeth, Twelfth Night, As You Like It, Julius Caesar. So they went about getting evidence of what actually these plays, every word of the play. So they talked to all the players in Shakespeare's company. They looked at different documents that showed the original play and then the play with notes added and then the revised versions. And they assembled all these plays along with the 18 existing ones. And they put them into a book, which was published, I think, in 1623. And if they had not done this, we would not have any record of any of those 18 plays. And also, I mean, the other plays they thought were right, but they double checked because there are no actual copies of any of Shakespeare's plays. None of them survived. Anyway, they produced this fabulous folio. They think there were about 1,000 copies produced. And also they got him an engraving at the beginning, that very famous engraving of Shakespeare with the domed head that is so recognizable. The artist didn't actually ever meet Shakespeare, but it's thought that he drew it from a descriptions, and various people at the time said it was very good likeness. So they produced about 1,000 of these folios, very huge books, and only about, I think, 280 odd survive today. Most are in museums. One was found recently. I mean, they keep finding them. One was found in France in a library under a pile of English books. Another was found in Mount Stuart House up in Scotland. That's the most recent one. And the last one that was sold for about $5 million in 2006. And at the time,
keep looking at that.
They cost £1.
You want to know one of my favorites? It's not. I think my favorite is probably Tutankhamen, but I won't show you that. I just want to show you this one. It's great fun. This is, again, it's part of history. This is a piece of paper that Churchill passed to Stalin. He shoved it across the table to Stalin during a discussion they were having in October 1944 about the future of Eastern Europe. And Churchill pushed it across and said, look, why don't, we want 90% of Greece, you have 10% of Greece. And you can have 90% of Romania, we want 10%. Unbelievably cynical document. Churchill shoved it across to Stalin, because Stalin, of course, his armies occupied Eastern Europe. And he said to Stalin, look, what do you think of this? And Stalin put a great big tick at the top right, because actually he was already in Eastern Europe. So what Churchill wanted was somewhat irrelevant to him. But he did agree to Greece being left under Western influence. 90% Greece, he said, would be accepted to be Western, American, British, and 10%, just 10% influenced by the Soviets. And so this wonderful little document, he pushed across the table, Churchill, and he said to Stalin, I said, it's a bit of a naughty document, this. It's rather cynical. I think, if we do agree this, I think I ought to burn it, don't you? And Stalin said, no, keep it. And Churchill kept it. And so we can now laugh at this thing that Churchill kept. which shows really how Stalin just left him completely standing.
Absolutely. Well, let's wind us up there. Thank you both very much indeed for being such good fun and for being with us this morning and giving us some great insights into what make this excellent book tick. It's available now from all good bookshops and, of course, via the invention of the excellent Mr. Tim Berners-Lee. Thank you both very much indeed again. Stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
It's been great fun.